Hello everyone, welcome back on Cloud Saviors. My name is Rahul Mujahid, and in this video, we are going to discuss the curriculum of SE 104, that is a Microsoft Azure Administrator Examination. So, if you want to pass out this certification, so of course, you must know the exact curriculum provided by Microsoft. So, I have the PDF where they mentioned the curriculum, or we can say the section. So we will discuss them one by one. We are having around 4 to 5 sections here. As you can see, the first one and the second one, third, and so on. So we'll take it one by one and explain it as much as I can. But still, if you have any questions, so please feel free to put your questions in comment section, or maybe you can message me on LinkedIn or Instagram as well. I've already dropped my links. By using that link, you can ping me on Instagram, or you can ping me on LinkedIn as well. So please feel free to ask any questions if you have any. Okay, so let me start with the first one. So this one is in the red one. As you can see, this exam was updated on 25 May 2021, right? I'm just recording this video on 20 June 2021. Okay, so it is saying this examination, this the curriculum of this examination, that is AZ 104, was updated on 25 May 2021. Okay, so we will discuss what kind of content has been updated, right? So let's start here. Okay, the audience profile. I believe that's a very simple English, and you can go through this. They mentioned about what kind of task you will be doing in this particular certification. Okay, so let me just move on to the curriculum. Okay, so basically, the first one we can say the module one, and I would say that is the most important part of this examination. This is manage Azure identities and governance. And one more thing is Azure Active Directory. So it is already a part of this particular module. So of course, if you are aware about admin task, right? So this certification is all about admin task and how you are going to perform it on Microsoft Azure, right? So, yep, there's a weightage of 15% to 20%. So, let's say out of 100%, the content on Azure Active Directory and Azure Identities, or we can say Azure Governance, it will be around 15 to 20%. But again, just to clear myself, it is not fixed. There might be a chances that you will get the questions around 25% or 30%. Okay, to take it like a high level overview, right? They are just suggesting that yes, it might be happen that you will get the exact questions around 25%, 20% on this particular topic. Okay, but still it is not promised. Okay, so the first one, manage Azure Active Directory, Azure AD objects. So, whatever, let's say, any kind of task you can perform on Microsoft Azure. Okay. For example, the basics one, whatever we used to do on on-prem Active Directory, kind of group creation, user addition and deletion, management, single sign-on, group policies. So these kind of tasks you have to perform on Microsoft Azure as well, right? But of course, if you're working on cloud, the way won't be same one. Let's say if you used to work on Windows Server 2012 R2 16 or maybe 19, right? Or maybe the previous one, that is the 2008 version. So the concept is still the same one, but how you gonna do it, that is a little bit different. Okay, so let me cover it one by one, then you can relate it easily. First is create users and groups, right? So of course, you have to create a users, you have to create a groups. So if I talk about Azure Active Directory, so user is not just limited to your let's say the users who are connected to your domains, right? There might be a chances where you have to add the users that are not part of your domain, maybe your client side, right? So they might belongs to any other domain. Question is how you are going to create these kind of users, how you are going to invite those users. Same thing is with the groups as well. You have to create some groups, you have to assign permission to these groups, right? So you should know how to create users and how to create groups. Create administrative units. Okay, so basically whatever admin task you can perform on Microsoft Azure, including any small task, including any big task, you should know how to create these administrative units on Microsoft Azure. Okay, manage user and groups properties, manage device settings, perform bulk user updates. So basically, you should know how you are going to manage the users and respective groups as well. Properties means the access level. What kind of access you are going to give to this particular group. Device setting, what kind of device can connect with your tenant, or we can say can connect in your environment or can log in your environment. So in device setting, you have to configure it the exact way what you used to do in your on-prem environment, but of course with little bit changes because now you are working on Microsoft Azure Active Directory. Now manage, okay, this one, perform bulk user updates. So let's say if you want to add more than 5 users, 10 users, let's say thousands of users, so how you are going to do it? The best way is PowerShell script. Okay, so these kind of small things you should know how you are going to do it, right? Then manage guest account. So you remember I mentioned the people who are not a part of your domain. So we call it guest users. We call it guest accounts. So how you are going to invite them in your environment and how you are going to assign some particular permission or let's say resources to these guest accounts. Okay, so you should know these things. Configure Azure AD join. Configure self-service password reset. Okay, Azure AD join is something when you want to connect your on-prem Active Directory with your Microsoft Azure Active Directory. This is something you can use by using Azure AD join. So you should know how to configure Azure AD join in MS environment. Configure self-service password reset. Of course, as the name suggests, you should know how to configure self-service password reset so your users can reset their password without asking admin, right? They can reset their password at their own. Okay, so these kind of small tasks, I would say very small tasks, you should know how to perform on Microsoft Azure Active Directory. So we have completed the 1.1, I would say, module number 1 and just a one section. So let me just move on to the second one. So second one is again Azure Active Directory. We can say the sub branch of Azure Active Directory. It is role based access control. So basically, it will cover create a custom role, provide access to Azure resources by assigning roles at different scopes, interpret access assignments. So basically, whenever we want to give any access to a particular user, let's say you are having a 10 virtual machine and you want to assign one virtual machine to one particular user. So how you are going to do it? So basically, you will assign one role to this particular user so that they can use the resources which you have defined. So as you can see, provide access to Azure resources by assigning roles at different scopes. Scopes is nothing, it is just your subscription, your resource group, or maybe your one single resource. It may be virtual machine, it may be storage account, it may be database, anything, whatever you can deploy on Microsoft Azure. Okay. The next one is manage subscription and governance. So configure Azure policies, the most important part of Microsoft Azure, right? Policies is something which restrict some actions on your subscription. Okay, so basically, you can just configure the policies exact like group policies as we used to do in Windows Server environment, right? On-prem environment. Then configure resource logs. Resource logs is something which prevent accidental deletion. So let's say if you are running one virtual machine, just a very small example, and by mistake you just click on the delete, and of course, although it asks for the confirmation, so you just click yes. Now what? It will start deleting. Now you cannot control it. You cannot stop it in the middle. right? It will be deleted in next 2 or 3 minutes. So how to prevent this accidental deletion? So we have Azure resource logs. Once you log the resource, then you cannot modify on and you cannot delete the resources. It depends. We have two kind of logs. One is for the modification, second is for the deletion. So it depends what kind of lock you have configured on your resources. Okay, so basically it will prevent the modification and deletion as well. Then apply and manage tags on resources, manage resource groups, manage subscription, manage cost, configure management groups. Okay, so basically tagging is something completely non-technical. If you want to segregate your environment, or we can say if you want to divide your environment and you want to give the name that yes, this virtual machine belongs to HR, this virtual machine belongs to marketing, and so on, you can just give the tag that yes, this is my tag name, this is my tag value, that's it. Okay, now resource group, we all know that the thing where we store or we create or we keep our resources, take it like a small bucket. Okay, then subscription, of course, whatever permissions and whatever role you have to define, you will define on these levels, maybe on subscription, maybe on resource group, or maybe on one single resource level. Manage cost, you should know how to manage a cost for a particular resource, for a particular RG, for a particular subscription, or maybe a group of subscription. Now configure management groups. Management groups is something which comes first under Azure hierarchy. First of all, we have management groups, then we have subscription, then we have resource groups here, right? So you should know how to manage and how to configure the Azure hierarchy, and how to configure the management, or we can say access level on different Azure levels, right? So congratulations, we have completed the level 1, or we can say the module 1, this one. Okay, so we have discussed this thing. Now let me just move on to the second one, that is the implement and manage storage. So now we are talking about the implementation and configuration, and second, management as well. Okay, so again the same thing, 15 to 20% it will cover the complete examination. So let's say 20% this one and 20% this one, right? So the questions would come up around from storage part around 15 to 20%, but of course take it like 25 or 30%, and just cover everything whatever they have mentioned here. Let me just take the topic number one, that is the secure storage. So configure network access to storage account, create and configure storage accounts, generate shared access signature SaaS tokens, manage access keys, configure Azure AD authentication for a storage account, configure access to Azure files. Okay, so before going to these terminologies, make sure you should know the types of Microsoft Azure storage account, because if you don't know the type, then you won't be able to understand what is Azure files and what is Azure blob storage. You should know the difference. What is the exact difference in Azure files, Azure blob storage, right, and Azure table? So these basic understanding you should know. Then go ahead with these remaining topics. These are network access. I mean, how you are going to provide the security on network level, right? Second is a creation and configuration. SaaS token is something if you want to, if you are creating something private, let's say your private container, and you want to give someone else access for a some particular time. So how you are going to do it? By keeping your privacy as well. So in this case, you will create one SaaS token. So you will share two things. One is the link, second is the token as well. So your client can access your storage account for some particular time. It depends your configuration, how you configure your SaaS token. Okay. Same thing with the access keys as well, just to protect your privacy, your private blob or your private container, whatever you have created on as your storage account, right? As your AD authentication, you are using your AD account as an authentication, right? While using this storage account, then configure access to Azure files. Azure files is exact the same thing what we use in on-prem. It follows the SMB protocol. So if you want to use the files, right? If you want to extend your on-prem DC, then we can use the Azure files. Okay. So you can even create the sync between your on-prem DC or your Azure file storage, right? Okay, so next one is manage storage, right? Basically export from Azure job, import into Azure job install and use Azure Storage Explorer, copy data by using Azure copy, implement Azure Storage application, configure blob object replication. So right now we are talking about the management. Let's say you are having one storage account. Now how you are going to manage these storage account? The first thing, export and import. So of course you should know how you're gonna export and import the data from Azure storage account. And the most important part is Azure Storage Explorer. This is a kind of a software where you have to install on your laptop, or we can say on your system. So by using this software you can access the storage account exact like you are using Microsoft Azure. Okay, so it would be easy for you just to export and import the data from your system, right? So that you can use command, you can use the GUI as per your requirement. Okay, so implement as your storage application, configure blob object application. So now we are talking about data replication. Of course you are keeping data in one region, or let's say in one availability zone. So it is really important to replicate the same data in any another let's say availability zone or in any another region. So you should know how, which kind of terminology, or we can say the way you can configure, you can just replicate your data. So we have different concept: RAGRS, GRS, LRS, right? So these kind of options you should know what kind of options I am having just to replicate my data into another region or maybe another availability zone. Okay, now configure Azure files and Azure blob storage. Create an Azure file share. Create and configure Azure file sync service, the sync service which I was talking about in previous section. Configure Azure blob storage, configure storage tiers, configure blob lifecycle management. This these three things I've already explained, right? Let me continue from the fourth one only. Configure storage tiers. Storage tiers are something, you must heard about: hot tier, cold tier, and archive tier. It's the same thing. Okay, it depends what kind of data you are going to store. Then you're supposed to select your storage tier. Configure blob lifecycle management. Blob lifecycle management is exact like, you must have heard about S3 lifecycle policies, right? This is the exact thing. So it's a kind of a automation that you just configure this thing that after 30 days my data should be in hot tier, and after 90 days my data should be in archival tier. So these kind of automation, or we can say lifecycle policies, you can configure by using blob lifecycle management. Okay, so again, congratulations, we just completed the second module. This is the Azure storage. So now we just discussed somewhere between 30 to 40% of our SG104 curriculum. Okay, so let me just start with the deploy and manage Azure compute resources. It will cover 20 to 25% of your complete SG104 examination. Okay, so right now we are talking about automate deployment of virtual machine by using Azure Resource Manager template. Okay, so modify an Azure Resource Manager template, configure a virtual hard disk VHD template, deploy from a template, save a deployment as an Azure Resource Manager template, deploy virtual machine extension. So just don't be panic when you see the automation, this word. It is very easy. Let me just clear this thing. Basically in this section we are talking about just to deploy one virtual machine, right? But by using ARM templates, by using Azure Resource Manager. So you can call it ARM templates, right? ARM template is nothing, it is just a JSON file. By using these files you can create your Azure infrastructure, right? So in this section we are talking about that we are going to create one virtual machine, but of course not by using Azure portal, but by using ARM templates. Okay, so you should know how to modify ARM templates and how to configure VHD by using ARM templates, and how to create a VHD template so you can create another virtual machine by using the snapshot. Okay, Deploy from a template, how to deploy any kind of resources by using arm templates. And of course, saving a deployment as an arm template. Deploy virtual machine extension may be anything, your log analytics extension, your domain joining extension, it may be anything, whatever you want to run the moment your virtual machine will start booting. You can use extension for this kind of installation. Okay, so very basics. Let me just go on to the second one. Configure virtual machine. Configure Azure disk encryption. Move virtual machine from one resource group to another. Manage VM sizes. Add data disk. Configure networking. Redeploy virtual machines. Configure high availability. Deploy and configure scale set. So right now we are talking about the configuration. Let's say disk encryption. If you want to encrypt your disk, yep, you can do it. Right? We have the solution for that. Now move VM from one resource group to another. If you want to move resources in between resource group in between subscription, so yes, it is also possible. You should know how to move it, right? Then manage VM sizes. So as you know, as per your requirement, we have different sizes. We have different families: CPU optimized, memory optimized, GPU optimized, and so on. So you should know what kind of families, what kind of VM sizes are available, and how you are going to deploy it, and what would be the costing part of your virtual machines. Add data disk. So how many disks you want in your virtual machine, it depends on your requirement again. Configure networking. You want to configure private IP, you want to configure public IP. This kind of networking configuration you should know, and you should know how to configure it, how to configure NSG, and how to configure these port numbers. You should know each and everything about networking, since it is an admin level examination. Okay, redeploy virtual machine. Configure high availability, deploy and configure scale set. So right now we're talking about the HA part, high availability and scale set. So of course, in a high availability, you should know how to configure a virtual machine, so in any case it shouldn't be go down, right? So you should know how to configure high availability, what kind of let's say terminologies we are having in high availability. And second is scale set, how you are going to configure a scale set, and what would be your trigger, what would be your criteria. Is it scheduled, or is it you are doing it by using any kind of alert, by using as your monitor? So you should know how to configure these things, right? Okay, now create and configure containers. Right now, we're talking about container, little bit part of Azure DevOps, or we can say the infrastructure that we use to deploy our, we can say workload, right? So we can say just a very little part of Azure DevOps. As you can see, we are having a case cluster as well, and Azure container, right? So you should know how to deploy one simple AKS cluster. You don't have to you don't have to configure very complex deployment, right? You just need to know the basics of AKS cluster, the basics of service fabric, the basics of app services, the topic which we are going to cover in the next section. So you should know how to configure the infrastructure for your application. Right now, we are not talking about the exact deployment. Right now, we are not talking about the CI/CD pipeline. Right now, we are only talking about the infrastructure, right? That would be needed just to host your application. Okay, so configure sizing and scaling for your Azure container instances, ACI. Configure container groups for Azure container instances. Configure storage for Azure Kubernetes services. Configure scaling for AKS. Configure network connection for AKS. Upgrade an AKS cluster. So these kind of tasks you should know, because of course it will comes under AZ104, or we can say it will come under we can say admin task, right? No one is asking you to configure CI/CD pipelines. No one is asking you to use the Terraform or use the Jenkins here. No, but you should know how to configure the infrastructure for your particular application. The same thing applies on create and configure as your app services as well. So it depends what kind of infra you're going to use. You're going to use AKS, use it. You're going to use app services, use it. It completely depends on your requirement. Okay, So create an app service plan. We have different plans. As I remember, isolate, standard, basics one, something like that. So choose the one, of course, as per your requirement. But make sure there is something called isolate. So isolate is very costly. So make sure you read out the pricing and everything before deploying anything on app services plan. Configure scaling setting in app service plan. What would be your scaling criteria? You should know that. You should know how to configure it. Create an app service, secure an app service, configure custom domain names, configure backup for an app services, configure networking settings, configure deployment settings. You should know how to configure a custom domain, right? By default, app services will give you a domain, I mean, kind of a link, so it won't look good if you're working in any kind of professional environment. For a testing part you can use it, but if you want to show to your client, and if you want to host any kind of application in a production, so you should know how to configure any custom domain, right? And of course backups and networking and the exact deployment as well. So of course we have a backup plan as well for the app services. You should know how to configure backups as well. So again, congratulations, we have completed the third one, the module number third. Now we have the fourth one, and the last one is the fifth one. Fifth one is very less and very small. So let me just cover it very quickly. So the fourth one, configure and manage virtual networking. Okay. So now, as you must have noticed, it is having more weightage than others. It is having 25 to 30% of your complete examination, right? So of course you have to focus here. You have to put your work. You have to perform some hands-on on virtual network and on subnets as well. So let me just take it one by one. Implement and manage virtual networking. Create and configure virtual network including peering. Configure private and public IP address. Configure user defined network routes. Implement subnets. Configure endpoints on subnets. Okay, so let me explain it first, then we will go forward. Create and configure virtual network including peering. You should know how to configure or how to deploy a virtual network. Second thing is peering. If you want to pair two networks, let's say you are and you have two virtual network, and now you want to establish a communication in between these two virtual network, right? So what you can do, you can just pair these network. So after pairing, it will act as a single network. You don't have to change any energy rule. It will work by default because now these networks are paired, right? You should know how to configure peering between the networks. Configure private and public IP address. Of course, that is very easy and self explanatory. Then configure user defined network. Now we are talking about UDR. If you want, first of all, we have the default route, which is provided by Azure. Second, we have an advantage. Then you can use your UDR as well. You can just configure your path, how your packet is moving from your source to destination. You can even configure by using UDR. You should know how to configure it. Of course, implement subnets. You have one big network, virtual network, and you have to divide it in two or three networks. So of course, you should know that how to divide these one big network in single subnets. Configure endpoints on subnet. How you are going to configure the endpoint. If you want to keep it private, so you can go for the private endpoint. If you want to establish a communication between Azure services, so you can use the private endpoint as well. So your services will be start talking, but without using any public IP address. So in this case, you can use the endpoints on subnets level as well. Configure private endpoint, the same thing which I just explained. Configure as your DNS, including custom DNS setting and private or public DNS zone. So of course, if you're talking about networking, so domain name must be there. Okay, you should know how to configure DNS and the custom DNS for these networks, whatever you are configuring here. Okay. Next one, secure access to virtual networks. How you are going to provide a security for your virtual network. Create a security rules, associate NSG to subnet or network interface. Evaluate effective security rules, implement as your firewall and implement as your bastion host. Basically, the most important part, NSG, one, you can configure it on subnet level. Second, you can configure it on NIC level, or we can say virtual machine level. Second is evaluate effective security rules. Just make sure your rules are up to the mark, right? Implement Azure Firewall and Azure Bastion host. You should know how to configure Azure firewalls. Of course, we would need one single dedicated subnet for the firewall, so you should know how to configure it. Then Azure Bastion host. If you are working in very, we can say zero trust environment. So in this environment, we use Bastion host just to access virtual machine, or we can say resources inside one single network. So you should know how to configure it and what is the exact meaning of Azure Bastion host. Okay. Now configure load balancing. Configure Azure Application Gateway. Configure an internal or public load balancer. Troubleshoot load balancing. If you are running any applications, you should know how to configure these load balancer on top of your resources, right? Then monitor and troubleshoot virtual networking. Monitor on-premises connectivity, configure and use Azure Monitor for networks. Use Azure Network Watcher. Troubleshoot external networking. Troubleshoot virtual network connectivity. The very important part of networking is Network Watcher, right? As the name suggests, it keeps on watching your network. So if you want to monitor your packet, if you want to configure IP flow logs, NSG flow logs, so you have to configure Network Watcher. So it will keep an eye on your network, on your incoming and outgoing packets. So if there is any wrong happens, you can just go back and troubleshoot your networking problems, right? And of course you can just monitor the connectivity between your resources as well. Okay, so for this troubleshooting, make sure you should know how to configure as your Network Watcher as well. Okay, now integrate an on-premises network with an Azure virtual network. So of course there might be a chances where you have to create a link between your private DC and your Azure environment. So of course we have a solution. You should know how to configure VPN gateway, how to configure express route, and how to configure virtual WAN as well. VPN gateway is something that you're gonna use the public network, right? But in the Azure Express route, you will be you will create one personal line, or I would say dedicated line, that will be used by you only. It is not publicly available, so of course, although it is very expensive, but yes, for very mission critical application, or where data leakage should not be happen. So in this case, we can use express route as well. You should know what is express route, what is the exact difference in VPN gateway and express route, and how to configure these VPN gateway and express route. Then we have Azure Virtual WAN. As the name suggests, if you want to create a model of hub and spoke, I mean one your headquarter and your branches. So for these purpose, you can use Azure WAN as well, just to control your other branches by using one single hub network. Okay, you should know how to configure it. Okay, again, so we have completed the fourth module. Now let me just move on to the fifth one, that is a very small. Monitor and backup as your resources. It will include 10 to 15%. It is very less, but of course you should know. And although to be honest, it is very easy. So we will cover monitor resources by using Azure Monitor, configure and interpret metrics, configure Azure Monitor logs, query and analyze logs, set up alerts and actions, configure application insights, right? So basically, you can put the alerts on your infrastructure. Like if this happens, so this action should be triggered. So this action may be anything, in the form of your email, in the form of your SMS alert, in the form of mobile phone, in the form of logic app, in the form of function app, anything, whatever you want, right? Even although we have something called log analytics workspace. So in this workspace, you can just keep saving your logs and your data which is coming from your environment, and you can just query these logs as per your requirement. App insights is something which you use just to monitor your application, right? So of course we are running some application on top of Azure resources. So what if you want to monitor your application? So in this case, we use application insights. Okay, implement backup and recovery, create recovery service vault RSV, create and configure backup policy, perform backup and restore operation by using Azure Backup, perform site to site recovery by using Azure Site Recovery, configure and review backup reports. Okay, perfect. So now we are talking about backups and recovery. Recovery service vault is something, a resource dedicated for the recovery and backups options, right? So whatever backups you perform, it will be saved in recovery service vault. So whenever you want to initiate any kind of backup, you can just take it from the RSV. Okay, so you should know how to configure backup policy. Maybe you have to give some inputs like schedule and timings, weekly, monthly, something like that. You should know how to do that. And of course, if something happens, then you should know how to recover the data from your backups as well. You should know how to perform site to site recovery by using Azure Site Recovery. And the last one is review backup reports. Whatever reporting you are managing, you should know how to review it, and of course how to configure it as well. So yep, we have covered almost 5 modules and 100% of your curriculum, which is dedicated for the Z104. Now let me just go through the pointers which has been changed on 25th of May. The first one is they just changed this name, and we already discussed this thing. Second one is this one: configure storage tiers for Azure Blob Storage. They just remove this line. I mean, the meaning is same, no big effect. Then we have configure and use network performance as your monitor for network. Okay, they just remove this name and replace it with the for networks. Okay, so we are good. Okay, that's it. So we have covered 100% curriculum for SE104, but still let me repeat myself as I just mentioned in my when I started this video. If you have any question, please put your comments and subscribe the channel. And of course, if you want to talk to me, just ping me on Instagram and just ping me on LinkedIn as well. Of course, we would have a talk, and I will guide you as well. And if you like the video, so make sure you hit the like button. And if you think you want to share this video with someone, your colleague or maybe your friend, so please do that. And of course, more questions, then we can have a discussion in comment section as well. So please do that. And yep, thanks for watching. So we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.